Can't tell if we're on or not. Looks like we are, maybe. Hopefully we are. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Here we go. Welcome, 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 everybody. Took a moment there, had a little bit of technical stuff, but welcome to another live stream here at Autocrit. I'm so excited to be talking about writing fantasy stories. I know it says specifically writing a fantasy book for the first time. And obviously, I'm going to be speaking a lot to that. So if you're a newbie, don't worry, I'm not going to throw a bunch of crazy jargon your way and things like that. But if you're somebody who's been doing this for a little while or you've been dabbling for a little bit, I should have some interesting tips and tricks as well. If you don't know who I am, my name is Daniel. I am the head instructor here at Autocrit. Autocrit really is the home for authors. We have our fully functional writing desk, which has all kinds of tools to help you plan, write, polish, even publishing tools for your story. And we have a community of authors like you that we love to exchange and discuss and all of that. And of course, we have an academy where we have workshops and courses to get into the nitty gritty and give you that personal interaction. Of course, we also have this YouTube channel. Feel free to like and subscribe, hit the bell, all those fun things, because we're putting up content here all of the time. So fantasy stories. It looks like we have some people here that are maybe newer to fantasy, which is great. Yeah, maybe you've written other books, but you haven't written specifically in the fantasy realm before. We're going to discuss some of the building blocks about fantasy. And to be honest, a lot of these are truth for a lot of genres. So stay with me, even if you're not a typical fantasy writer. But maybe I'll turn you into one. So, one of the biggest concerns I have with fantasy authors is what I like to call world building disease. I mean, this is a phrase you hear in the writing sphere. World building disease is a common thing where, as fantasy authors, we love to play in the sandbox. We love to create new worlds. We love to take that what if scenario, what if unicorns were real? What if the city of Atlantis was real? And then we love to run with it and come up with everything from the food to the banking systems to, to the dance style or whatever, right? And we just love to have all of this information. And you know what? I am not going to condemn you. I am not going to criticize you for coming up with all of this. However, it can be a dangerous path to go down if you actually want to get a book written. Because what will happen is you'll just brainstorm, play in your sandbox, blah, 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 blah. And then you haven't put any words on the page. Not anything that anybody's going to read. Might be a great Wikipedia article or, for your own story Bible, but it isn't a story, right? So you got to get to actually writing the story. And I think for some fantasy authors, they look at these beautiful worlds, Tolkien and Brandon Sanderson and George R. Martin, whatever. And they're like, wow, they put in so much rich detail. How do I do that? I've got to have all this rich detail. And true, to a certain extent. But the question is how much do you need that before your first draft, right? How much do you need that even before maybe your second draft, right? A lot of these things can be developed on the fly as you go. You don't have to answer every question. We wouldn't think this way about a book series, right? Necessarily. I know some people do outline and plan out all of these different things. And they have a whole 7-book series all in their head, all ready to go before they write book 1. Yeah, sure. Most of us wouldn't do that, right? Even if we're outliners, we'll outline book 1, maybe have an idea of the arc, but we haven't figured out every little detail because that's a whole lot of process. And and we're probably going to get tired and bored with the project before we even get anywhere. So this is the issue. The issue is I will talk to writers and it's like, have you written your book? And like, no. And I'm like, well, why not? And they're like, oh, I don't know, but it's amazing. It's got this and that. And they have all these wonderful ideas. And it's a world I want to visit. It's a world I want to spend time with. And I can't because they've given me no window into it. It just sits in their whatever, in their document on their hard drive. And it's closed off. There's no window to it for me. And that's sad. So what I generally recommend is to give yourself an arbitrary deadline. I'd say an arbitrary because you're never really going to stop world building. And so you just give out yourself a little bit of time and then you say, you know what, at this point, I'm just going to move forward. Maybe after you write that book, you'll be like, I could have used a little more time. All right, give yourself a little bit more time the next time or things like that. But you just need to get going. Keep in mind, your first draft, often people call your garbage draft or whatever. It just has to exist. It's your block of granite you're going to carve into a beautiful sculpture, right? So don't panic about it. Mostly writing is smoke and mirrors. There can be the illusion of depth even when it doesn't exist. But that gets to the next question. What makes a believable world? All right, you're telling me I don't want to spend all my entire life inventing this world. How do I make sure it's believable? Well, generally, the basic answer to this question at a high level is what makes a believable world is a world that seems to exist before and after the confines of your story. In other words, the story isn't informing everything in the world. The world just exists, and this is a story you're telling in the world. But technically, there could be other stories. You could have gone a different direction. So, this is something to sort of ask yourself when you're in that world building stage. You could say, well, what if I didn't want to write this book? Let's just take a step back. What if I want to write a different book entirely about this world? How easy would it be? The easier it is to do that, the more rich of a world you have, and the more believable it will be to the audience, right? And while you're at it, there you go. You got an idea for a spin-off novel, short story, a whatever, a lead for your email list. You've already brainstormed some things, so there you go. You get two for the price of one. But yeah, generally you want to make sure that there are things about the world that predate your story and you can postulate about the future. Now, that being said, I'm going to sort of nuance this point a little bit. um, I'm going to verb that. And I'm going to say that you want to be careful about the kind of detail you layer in here that doesn't specifically pertain to your story. So just because you could, in fact, tell 5 stories about this world doesn't mean your book needs to be 5 stories. That might be a little bit intense. You might have subplots, but yeah, trying to tell all those stories in one book with that word count, you're going to fly at a really high level and it's not going to be immersive, right? You're not going to get the depth. You're not going to get the emotional gravitas out of all of this. So what you want to do is you want to focus on that main plot. That main plot, uh, the general rule of thumb is information shouldn't be included that isn't going to benefit this current conflict that you know about. The current conflict that you know about. And there may be a conflict in the future it's foreshadowing. That's not information you need right this moment. Now, that's not all the information you can include or may include, right? It is the information you need to include. So if you start there, you'll at least prevent the info dump. It might simplify your book too much, particularly in the fantasy genre, where that extra information allows for texture and other things. So you can layer that back in, but you may want to start by cutting it down, or at least as you do your developmental editing, really ask yourself, okay, do I absolutely need to know this? And just try to cut down. Because it might hurt you in a sense. But to be honest, a lot of this world building finds its way to the surface somehow through word choice, through subtext, things like that. It has a tendency to surface no matter what. Now, when it comes to the world building and orienting yourself, I have draw map, but I really mean like in general, picture things, write things down, take notes. Don't just allow your mind to try to hold all of these ideas. I mean, within the Autocrit Writer's Desk, we have a wonderful note card system. You can go and you can make notes. You can even draw a map and put the picture in there and things like that. What you don't want to have happen is you write the story and then a beta reader points out, hey, you established in this chapter that this town was this far from this town. It was a day's journey. And later it's like they're walking across the street because you just forgot, particularly if it's really dense. The other thing that can happen when you do this is you're pinning things down, right? It's no longer this abstract world. It's like, this is a real place. And now you can come up with some concrete scenes, some concrete bits of tension. You can invent entire plot arcs without it because you might have not have thought, hey, it is that far from that place to that place. That means if there's a time crunch, if somebody's dying of a poison and they haven't got there in time, that's going to make things more interesting. And maybe they'll take a shortcut. And what if there is a shortcut? And what could the shortcut be? It's really helpful for you to do that level of brainstorming where, again, you take it from this abstract thought into a concrete plan about, what it is you're talking about. This can be as simple as just an outline of the islands that make up your kingdom. It can get a little more intense than that. The smaller scope of the story, the more in detail you tend to be able to be at, right? Like your whole story, fantasy story, could take place at a high school. And so it's like, okay, what's the layout of the high school? right? It doesn't take that much effort, and it doesn't have to be beautiful. Nobody has to see this. It could be some cheesy thing and go in MS Paint or whatever, and you like, squares and everything. But it's just a way for you to orient yourself. And again, you'll use it as inspiration later on. It can be really helpful. When it comes to your story, moving on from the world building, you need to ask yourself questions about the people that inhabit the world. Ultimately, the most important window into your story, into your world, will be the characters. We are, people that like to read about other humanistic characters, right? Even if it's an animal, they tend to be fairly anthropomorphic. And that's because, yes, this is how we relate to the world. And so you want to ask yourself, who inhabits this world and what kind of stories do they have? And again, this can be helpful when figuring out exactly what plot you need to tell or making sure you get the most mileage out of your plot. You need to ask yourself, who is the strongest right now in this world and who is the weakest? Who are the underdogs? Who have the power? Don't forget humor. Don't forget the fact that to some degree, this situation is absurd, right? Reality is absurd. If you ever watch a stand-up comedian, what do they generally do? They point out the absurdities of the mundane. They make you see things a different way. They point out weird cultural habits that seem counterintuitive or behaviors that don't make a lot of sense, right? And it's very funny. They'll point out taboos, things that you're just not supposed to talk about, inconvenient truths, and things like that. This same thing should exist in your world. So, one thing that could be a fun activity to try, this is just a fun, crazy brainstorming thing to do, but literally write a stand up comedian talking about your world, right? Now, you may be like, I know, Dan, I'm not really that funny in general. I'm not really that. Fair enough. But just think about what their bits might be about. You don't have to actually land the punchline. It doesn't have to, you don't have to be Jerry Seinfeld or something like that. But you just maybe didn't think of it that way. If you think about it, a lot of times that little bit of humor can make the story feel more relatable, human, and it can sometimes they call it hanging a lantern, right? When you bring to the attention of the audience that you understand something's kind of contrived, but you're like, just go with me. Can you just give it to me? So, like, an example would be, Princess Leia says, can somebody get this walking carpet out of my way for Chewbacca? It is pretty funny that you have this big walking character that's just really hairy, right? And they're more or less like a walking carpet. And it's funny. And it also feels realistic. It feels like the kind of comment that somebody would make if the world actually existed. If we take it just so seriously all the time, I think one danger is that artists feel like you have to take it seriously because if you're making fun of your own story, as it were, if you are if you are kind of mocking some of the elements, it's almost like you're saying it's not believable, it's not real, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. It doesn't have to be like that. I'm not talking about like Deadpool breaking the fourth wall sort of stuff. I'm talking about the kind of thing that somebody would say in real life. Again, like a stand up comedian. They're not trying to imply that the world is just one big simulation. Unless that's their bit. But, most of the time they're pointing out reality, but just in a funny way. So keep that in mind. All comics do is crowd work. You're right. A lot of what comics do now is just interact with the crowd and banter with them and say kind of things you're not supposed to say and self-deprecation and things like that, roasting. Again, though, but that's the thing. Roast your world, roast your characters, self-deprecation. These are all things that can really benefit a situation. And again, it helps you realize that you're one step ahead of the audience. If you're pointing out something that they see is a little bit silly, then they're like, oh, okay, I get it. I can believe in this because it's not just meant to be something that I have to take at face value and I can't be analytical about it. Try to break the world. Violence. Yeah, break the world. Now, whenever you have a system of government, an economic system, a cultural system, there are ways to break it. There are ways to exploit it. You can slip in your way in there, and you can find a way to game the system. What would be the ultimate way to game the system? Is there some resource that's really difficult to get at? What could you do in order to make sure that that resource, you hoard that resource? What could you do in order to generate copies of that resource or just all different kinds of things like that, right? We certainly see this in the regular world. There's a lot of people that you could say are going about things the right way, right? And then there are people that are skirting the law, skirting ethical boundaries in order to make things better for themselves. And in some ways, people would say those are the ways that our current systems are broken, right? It's not an idyllic world. There's certainly things to complain about. And this should be the same thing in your world. Now, I understand it's pretty common to do kind of a dystopia where it's like everything is broken. Okay, fair enough. But even if it's not quite as dramatic as that, if it's not like the only thing the society needs is basically a ground up change, you want to ask yourself, where are the loopholes? The other thing you want to do is ask yourself where are the loopholes, because that's where laws are created, right? It's when resources become easily exploited that people start to think, wait, we need to do something about this. We need to figure out a way to regulate this. And then you have enforcement procedures and police forces and all kinds of things like that, right? And so it can help you figure out where those conflicts are, but particularly it can help you avoid plot holes, because one thing you don't want is for somebody to bring up, but wait a minute, if you've established that X is true, right? And they want to accomplish this goal, and X is a really great way of accomplishing it. Why aren't they just using X? And so, yes, you need to constantly ask yourself about, to use a gaming term, that overpowered card that you might have in your a game, in your book, and how you can mitigate against it. And perhaps the whole book is about overcoming a mitigation around a regulation of something, right? Over a regulation to mitigate something, right? They're trying to get around the law in order to fix something, and maybe they should, maybe the law is wrong in your world, whatever. Those are all potential possibilities. You want to ask yourself who has the most at stake right now in the world. Now, does your story need to be about that person? No, it doesn't have to be. Is it a person that's generally the most interesting? Sure. But, if you always make it that person, it often ends up being the chosen one syndrome, which chosen one is a wonderful trope. It's very empowering. We all would love to be like the central figure of the universe. It's wish fulfillment and all of that. But you don't always have to write that, right? It's not always the person who maybe has the most to gain or lose in a situation that you're writing about. Sometimes it might be hard to argue who really does have the most. There's a lot of people with similar levels of at stake. But one thing that is tricky, of course, is if you write about somebody who doesn't seem to have much at stake right now in the world, either for it to change or for it to stay the same. If they aren't like, in the top tier of that, you're in a real kind of a risky spot. It's not impossible, but you might be making your life overly complicated. You may want to ask yourself, well, why am I not writing about the person who has more to gain or lose about the world changing or staying the same? Aren't they a more compelling person? So you need to think that about. Oh, I have a good question there from Tanya. I'll get to that in just a little bit. This is something that I harp on all the time, and I would love to apologize and because I do it all the time, but be honestly, I can't, because it's just something that comes up so frequently when I do developmental editing for people, I story coach them, and so often, one of my first questions is what is failure for this person? What would be a failure state for this book? How do I know that the person did not win? And it seems like a pretty straightforward question. And feels like a very straightforward question. But a lot of times people can't answer it because they're thinking of the book way too abstract. They're not thinking about just the core, this character desires this trackable thing. Will they get it or not? Now, you might say, yes, Daniel, but what about the fact of what if they don't know what they want? How often do we know what they want? Is that realistic? And the answer is, yeah, you're right in that they don't have to know what they want, but it's still trackable. If we know what they want, we know if they're closer or further away from it. And then, of course, they can pivot later and we can realize what they wanted, what their goal wasn't what they needed. Fair enough, right? But at the beginning of the story, by the time you get to that 25% or so mark, by the time you get to that catalyst, that call to adventure moment, we need to know what failure looks like. We need to know what's at stake. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to invest ourselves in the book. And by then, that's where you get to the do not finishes. That's where you get to the people that give up a lot of the time. I mean, there's other points where they can, but this is a big one because they're like, yeah, nothing really has exactly happened, right? I don't really understand what the story is about. Like, cool things are happening, but I don't really get it. Like, where is this all going towards? Yes, you need the going towards thing. Now, if you're a complete pantser, you might not know that, right? You just start off in a cool scenario. But my hope is that by 25% in the book, you can at least tell me that. You don't even have to know if they get it or not, but you can at least know what they're going towards, right? It's a pretty easy thing to ask. But yeah, you want to know what it is, and you want to know potentially what the biggest obstacle is between them and their goal. And you also want to think of the scope of your character journey. The reason why this is important is because this informs how long of a book you need to write. Um, so if you want to write a short story, I don't generally recommend that your starting point for your character journey is I don't know anything about the magical world, and the end of the character journey is I am the sorcerer supreme. That's a pretty big lift for a few thousand words, right? Um, I'm not saying it's impossible. Nothing is impossible, but like, why would you do that to yourself? No, it tends to be more a minor thing. Like, I don't know if magic is real. Oh, magic is real. Like a smaller switch. I can't master this specific spell. Oh, I have mastered that spell. Something like that, right? I don't know how to get past. Uh, I don't know how to wake up a dragon. Oh, I have woken up a dragon, right? It's a smaller journey. That doesn't mean, though, there wasn't a journey and that they learned something, they changed their behavior. All of these things can happen. Now, of course, if you're talking about a larger work like a book, it might have much more of a larger scope. You could start somebody as I don't know anything about magic to a I'm the sorcerer supreme, right? You certainly could have that. However, you may decide that's still too much for a single book. That's really the series. Okay, fair enough, right? I start out, I don't know anything about magic. By the end of it, I'm defeating a very powerful dark wizard. So that's a multiple book series. Fair enough, right? The larger the scope of the work, the more important the problem seems to be, or more insurmountable the problem seems to be. Ergo, the problem needs to feel insurmountable. Ergo, the growth of the character needs to be fairly substantial. Otherwise, you're just treading water for a long period of time, right? And if you don't have any growth at all, then the question is why did you even tell me the story? We don't share things that happen in life where there's no change from the beginning of the end in our life. I mean, not a compelling one. Even if it's, well, I'll never go to that restaurant again. It was lousy. That is a change in your behavior, right? If you just said, oh, that place was the worst, it was the pits. And like, oh, okay. And it's like, I'm going there tomorrow. You're like, well, then why did you tell me how bad it was, right? What was the point of all of that? It didn't seem to affect your behavior. So this is the point. You want to make sure that we can see that. And of course, you want to dramatize, not summarize those sorts of actions. All right, I have a few questions here and I'll get to that. But before I do want to point out that we have wonderful Autocrit events all of the time. We have Hook 'em, which is coming up very soon, where you can give us your opening line and then we tell you, did it hook us? Did it make us interested? What kind of promises do we think it's making? We have Squirrel, a guide to staying on task. Mostly, which is going to be a lot of fun for those of you who tend to get distracted and things like that. We also have a fantasy sci-fi club session coming up. Of course, you can check out all of these. Oh, and an accountability club. You can check out all of these inside autocrit.com. If you check out the hub, we have our list of events. All of these events are free or included in your Autocrit Pro membership. So certainly check that out. I also want to point out that we have an entire fantasy course. I'm seeing so many great fantasy questions here, and I'm going to get to them in just a second here. But we do have an entire fantasy course. It just kicked off last night, so you can start off watching the replay of the first night. Story, sorcery, and the quest to write stronger fantasy. It's 4 live sessions and a whole lot of extra materials. And once you get into it, you have the recordings and all the materials as long as you want. It doesn't expire. All right, let's go back to these questions here. So let's see what we got. You would love to hear about rules for writing fantasy and sci-fi and where they diverge and do not intercept. All right, so this is a tricky question because really these genres do overlap a fair amount. It tends to be a lot of tropes and it tends to be a mindset thing more than anything else because you will have people that will disagree. I personally think of Star Wars as fantasy and not sci-fi. I know some people say sci-fi fantasy, but to me I really do like a distinction. And this is where I put the distinction. The distinction is fantasy is wonder, wish fulfillment, wow, right? Sci-fi tends to be exploration, discovery, astonishment. They're a little bit different. So, for example, a fantasy is this is completely this is completely defying everything that I've known. Wow, isn't it amazing? Sci-fi is this is counter what I expect from the world. I want to figure out how this works. Now, that's not to say that fantasy can't have world building elements that sort of do this to a certain extent, but you'll notice you rarely really get a full explanation in fantasy, even, and I understand sci-fi doesn't always, there's the techno babble and all of that. I get it, and that's where it can get a little bit fuzzy. But a lot of times it's just a mindset. It's all right, am I analyzing the wow? Am I really trying to figure it out? It's kind of the difference between like Jurassic Park. It's not just wow, it's really cool the dinosaurs are alive. It's like, well, should we even bring them back? What about the ethics of this? Should you make money this way? Is this really safe? Is there such a thing as really controlling nature? Right? It gets very existential, it gets very philosophical, right? And again, fantasy can certainly get philosophical about moral dilemmas and things like that. What do you do with power and things like that? But it tends to be more about going with the moment, the wow of the moment, the wonder of the moment, and not so much. I'm, and I don't want to imply that it's not thoughtful, but it's thoughtful in a different sort of way. It tends to be more about expanding your mind, being willing to accept things that aren't real, do you really need an explanation for everything, that sort of thing. And so there is a little bit of an overlap, but I would say, yeah, somebody's asking me another one, so this is another overlap. Alien is horror sci-fi, and in my opinion Alien is horror, not sci-fi, because to me the intrigue of Alien is just survival and exploiting deep rooted human fears. That's the central question. The central question is survival against other being that seems insurmountable and exploits a lot of phobias. You know, particularly there's a lot of sexual subtext to Alien, um, and dealing with phobias involving that. And so I would classify Alien as horror, but it's a sci-fi setting. But yeah, no, I don't think you walk away with a lot of pontificating questions uh, about the alien itself so much. The alien is interesting in how much it poses as a foe and how much it scares you. So, but yeah, when it comes to genres, there is a blurring of the line, and it doesn't really matter that we don't have exact definitions because why do we care? And the reason why we care is because we want to market to the right audience. And that is not necessarily a genre question in terms of it's not like if you say Alien is sci-fi that the wrong people are going to watch it as long as they have a creepy poster and it says in space and nobody can hear you scream. Okay, I'm pretty clear what I'm signing up for, right? You watch that trailer, it doesn't look like a calm, relaxing, reflecting thing about an alien force. It's not Arrival, right? It is I'm going to be terrified out of my mind. So whether or not it's like, well, I don't want to see it because I don't really like spacey things. A lot of times what will happen is people will watch it that like spacey things. That's why you have a lot of people who love Star Wars who don't like Star Trek, right? Because they're not really the same. All right. That's a really great question. But yeah, I would say, it's an audience expectation is really what you're asking. You're asking, am I going to write what an audience would enjoy? And by that, you're gonna think smaller in terms of genre. You're gonna think of story types, and you're going to think of comparison books, and books that are similar to yours in terms of the audience, and look at what they do in order to figure out if you have audience expectations. Of course, you can also just not care and be like, I just like these concepts. What is it? I'm not entirely sure. And then eventually you'll probably need to bring in another party to help you market the thing, because otherwise you won't know who to reach and how to make your book cover and things like that. But if you just want to be a crazy artist, by all means, don't worry about your genre. It can be a lot tougher to make an audience that way. On the other hand, you can be a gold mine. Look at something like Outlander. What genre is it? When people say romance, it's not exactly a romance. It's not exactly adventure. It's not exactly historical fiction. It kind of, it's kind of all of those things and none of those things at the same time. So, yeah, keep that in mind. All right. Fantasy is a tricky genre because there is no story type attached to it. And what I mean by that is, like, romance is also a story type, right? Romance is happily ever after, happily for now, story type. People are trying to get together, story type. Mystery, story type. A crime, almost always a murder, needs to be solved, story type. Fantasy can be a romance story type, right? Because you can have a fantasy about people getting together and happily ever after, happily ever now is the ultimate goal of the story. Disney's movies, for example, would you call Disney movies capital R romance? No, they're fairy tales, but they are a romance story type, right? What about mysteries? Yeah, Prisoner of Azkaban is a mystery plot. Who is Sirius Black? What is he up to, right? Is it a capital M mystery? No, right? J.K. Rowling writes capital M mysteries now, so it's not surprising that she would do it as a mystery story type. But no, Harry Potter is not. It is a capital F fantasy. So there you go. Fantasy story type may be a quest. Yes, if you want to say anything that might feel like a fantasy story type, the hero's journey is kind of the story type most associated with fantasy. But keep in mind, the hero's journey can exist outside of fantasy, like sci-fi or historical fiction or something else. Really, it's only romance and mystery that are forced into a story type and a genre at the same time. I mean, some people love to throw out genres altogether. Like Save the Cat literally just talks about story types and it doesn't even want to make genres because it says it's not helpful. And I understand why it's saying that, because in many ways, the audience expectation for a story type is more important. And by the way, if you're wanting to know more about this, we do have a video about story types, and I will link it in the description later on. It's on this YouTube channel. Or if you want to do a quick search, you can find it. It was exactly when you talked about resources and by whom and who they should be gamed that it started to remind you of your sci-fi project. Yeah, sci-fi is often about that. It's about like the economy and it's about how do we sustain things and things like that. Fantasy can be about that, but often fantasy doesn't want to concern itself with such because that would kind of defy the wish fulfillment. You're very welcome. This is what we love to do. What we love to do is talk about writing. It's only because of all of you I can do this. I love it. Thank you so much for being a part of this. I want to go back though before I wrap this up. I was kind of getting on, and I want to make sure that I have wrap this up here. So, magic fantasy and magical realism. The difference tends to be the ask of the audience, to be honest. Magical realism, as it says, is kind of just a few shades away from what is real. And often, magic realism doesn't even answer the question as to whether or not the magic is real. It keeps it vague for the audience. And so you can be like, well, I don't know. Was that actually a ghost or was it not? Right? That kind of thing. That tends to feel very magical realism, or it is basically real life with just a slight twist. Um, but I will say, so it's really what you're asking of the audience to accept as the conceit of your story is the biggest difference from what I have seen on that. And magical realism, I do agree, does tend to come from the Hispanic community, I believe is where it originated from. I think that is true. Um, what if what they want is what they need? Then that's fine. You just have a very put together person. Nothing wrong with that, right? Like, look at the Little Mermaid. Oh, I want to be where the people are. What does she need? She wants to be where the people are. That's correct. She gets what she needs, which is acceptance in the human world, because that's what she wants. Fine. Um, you could say, isn't that simplistic? It might be a little simplistic because how often do we actually know what we need? But it's not like it never happens. It's okay. right? Um, in in the Lord of the Rings, what does Frodo need to do? Frodo needs to throw the ring into the volcano. That's also what he wants to do, right? Fair enough, right? You could say, well, he ultimately just wants peace and contentment, and that's how he gets there. Fair enough, but the concrete way he's going to get there is by doing that mission. And that's clear from the beginning. It doesn't change. The ending is very interesting in terms of how that manifests itself, right? Whether or not he can actually pull it off, but it does not change. Nothing wrong with that. Again, though, there is a fairy tale like aspect to a story like that. It's just so clear cut, and good versus evil and things like that. And I love that sort of classic story. But some people will switch for things like that. How do you decide on a final version for the book? I'm assuming you're asking, how do you know when you're actually done? For instance, often I'm planning out a piece of my world or even plot, and I could see a few ways, and you have trouble picking. Okay, I'm going to tell you an answer you might not like. But if you truly feel like there is no right answer, sometimes you flip a coin. You just say, I have to move forward. So I'm just going to do it this way because either could work. And you know what? Plan B doesn't have to die. It could be a sequel, it could be a spinoff, or it might come back because plan A, when you actually are writing it, is not going to work out as well as you thought. And you're like, oh, I should do plan B, right? Another thing you could, of course, ask is other people. You could say, I could write it this way or this way, which is more interesting to you. Generally, the easy way to answer is what's going to be the most dramatic, right? What's going to be the most pain? Start brainstorming a little bit further than that, like scenes, action set pieces, moments that could happen. Pinnacle moments are really helpful. Like those moments, like what if they made it a movie? Those moments, brainstorm all that and like give yourself a very short period of time. I'm like talking minutes, and be like, okay, how many ideas can I get down? Blah, 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 and figure out which one you could do more ideas. That kind of tells you which one has the more potential, perhaps. That's another way of solving that problem. But there's nothing wrong with just, I'm going to flip a coin because who cares, right? Like if they're both equal, we'll do both. Just say yes to both, but I have to do one first. Which one? That one, right? I'll do it again. Oh, Axel, yay! Yeah, Axel is in my fantasy course. So glad to have you there. Uh, what aspects of world building can be used for any genre? All of them, in my opinion. Um, there's no such, like, all genres require at least some world building. Even if you're writing romance and it's set in the real world, it's not really. It's set in a, I mean, I guess it could be all real in that, like, you literally go to a building that actually exists and all of that. But even then, you have to build the world for me. I've never been there before. So let's say you set the whole romance in a skyscraper that really exists in downtown Baltimore or something. Well, I've never been to that skyscraper. And so you will have to build up what that is and why that's interesting to you and the culture around it and all of that. No matter what, world building is a factor. Now, obviously, in a fantasy, it's more of a factor because we don't know anything about this world at all. Like, we may have no orientation to it. Imagine it's the submerged city of Atlantis. Well, I have no idea what it's like to live in a submerged city, right? So you have to do a lot more effort to make it believable and explain things than maybe more magical realism, where this is just your typical bake shop in the middle of a small town, but it has a portal to a world where they get bread or something. And then in which case you have to do a lot of world building for the portal world, not so much for the normal world, right? Because it's like, okay, I kind of know what a bake shop is. You could maybe with a few shorthands things say what it is, right? The kind of place that feels like a 20-year-old yuppie would be at home or something, and you can get an idea of what kind of thing it is. All right. Nonfiction helped you do world building better. It does. You're right. That's true. If you find world building difficult, stop and world build a real place that you know really well and write about that. And then figure out, oh, these are my shortcomings as an author in terms of relaying the world, right? It's not like I don't have all these brilliant ideas about how to make up a world because I'm very imaginative, but am I conveying it well to the audience? Well, if you can't convey to the audience the real world in a way that they'll understand, because like you can start asking them questions like, this is just a, am I downloading the information to you, right? You can write a piece that's like a page, not very long, write a piece that's a page that describes a location that meant something to you as a child, and then just ask them questions like, what do you think this would be about the world? What do you think about this in the world? Where did you get from that? And figure out if you were able to convey with your words the kind of place it was. What advice do I have when writing a fantasy doesn't have magic but has pirates? Well, I'm assuming you're writing a fantasy with pirates. Magic is certainly not a requirement for fantasy. I would think of Toy Story as a fantasy movie because it's a world in which toys are alive for no particular reason. Magic has nothing to do with it. There is nothing paranormal about Toy Story except the fact you have anthropomorphic toys. So I don't know what is the fantastical elements of the pirates. I'm assuming it is not historical fiction. There's something unusual about the pirates that maybe they're aardvarks. I don't know. By the way, write an aardvark pirate story. I'll read it. But I don't know what's fantastical about them. But as long as there is a fantastical element, yes, you have a fantasy for sure. If it's not, then you might have historical fiction. It might just be about pirates, right? If it really could have happened, then it's not really fantasy. What's the difference between high hero and epic fantasy? So when you get into terminology like this, it gets somewhat subjective because people will define them different ways. Generally, how I hear high fantasy talked about are things like Lord of the Rings. Brandon Sanderson often does that. Things like that. The typical hero's journey, quest stories, that kind of thing. The capital F fantasy in the traditional sense of the word. Um, so that is often when you think of epic, again, that speaks to scope. It's not somebody who just learned how to wake up a sleeping dragon. It is somebody who went from farmer to sorcerer supreme or something like that. um in terms of hero fantasy, yeah, same thing. I would have to, different people use these different terms. Low fantasy, I usually hear more low and high fantasy, right? Low fantasy tends to be things like Harry Potter or Artemis Fowl or things like that, where it's not a completely made up world. It's like the world is under our nose, but it's not tonally like an urban fantasy either. It is still fairly noble and moralistic in nature. But again, when it comes to these definitions, you're talking about art, and so the definitions are pretty wispy. And they serve a purpose if they help you find the audience. Again, the question you want to ask yourself is this story well suited for the group I'm trying to reach? If you're trying to reach people who like Tolkien, then you want to say, all right, this is epic fantasy like Tolkien. Okay, fair enough, right? But that's not the only kind of fantasy out there. Do I think for fantasy, showing versus telling is a more serious issue? No, I don't think so. It's always a big issue. I mean, it's a common piece of writing advice for a lot of reasons. It's pretty complicated. Again, we have videos on that. We have a whole workshop on it because it is a very complicated rule. It really comes from the film world, not the writing world, which is why it's kind of confusing. Because, like, show what? I don't show anything. I tell you everything. Like, listen to an audiobook. What are they showing? But what they obviously mean, and I think a lot of you know that, is are they demonstrating? Are they dramatizing instead of summarizing or simplifying? Are they actually letting you experience it versus just distill it down to basically like a cliff notes, right? And so, yeah, that will be a problem in any genre. It's not just a fantasy thing. Where fantasy ends up being a telling issue is because you do have exposition that you realize is not compelling enough to really dramatize, or you can't. It has to be somebody talking about the past. And you can end up with the quote unquote info dump where they're just giving you all this data and you have like kind of no idea why it's even relevant. It just seems to be stuff to know. And sure, maybe it foreshadows later, but it's like all this background information. And you do have to be careful about that in fantasy because there is a lot of world building involved. There's a lot of depth, right? Like if I said something in the real world and I'm like, I went to the city of Chicago. I don't have to be like, well, the city of Chicago was formed back because I know what the city of Chicago is, right? Like the context of the city of Chicago. And obviously, depending on what year it is, it's a very different city. But like, as long as we've established that, it's like, okay, I know what's baked into that concept, right? Whereas if you say the city of Dominionopolis, it's like, I don't even know what this place is. What's its background? How big is this place, right? And so you have a tendency to want to include all of that and be like, this city was developed after the Orc War of 1455, and it's like that can end up feeling very telly, right? It's this information, and we're like, what's the point? Why is all of that? Do I feel like the definition of high versus low fantasy has changed over time? The only person that I know of that has popularized these terms is Brandon Sanderson. Talks about high fantasy and low fantasy, I believe, is who kind of invented it. And he's a big name, so I'm assuming his definitions still apply. But I do know, when definitions get out there, they get fuzzy, especially when it comes to art, right? What even is art, right? Define art as a concept. It's very hard, right? So it could be really tricky. Because, like, if any human creation art, most people would say no. Is it only intentional human creation? I don't want to get too philosophical, but this is the point, right? Definitions are important when they serve a purpose. So why do we use these terms? Why do we say high fantasy, low fantasy? It's because I want to write something that is effective at what it's trying to be. And in order to know what it's trying to be, I have to define it. And again, I think the best definition are looking at things like, what is the story about? What's motivating the characters? And then when it's audience, reaching an audience, having conversation, where does it sit on the bookshelf? I think that's going to be more important than getting too bogged down on what you call it, right? Because essentially you can call it anything as long as it's definable. That word makes sense. If that label doesn't really matter as long as the label makes sense in terms of utility. I don't know art, but I know it when I see it. Exactly. I think that is an accurate view of art, but it is not. It's an abstract one. Epic and saga used interchangeably. Yeah, because again, these are not very clear. Saga, often you think of it must contain multiple volumes, right? You don't think that you don't think of this as a saga and it's just one book. So immediately I think series, whereas epic can be one book. There are epic novels that are one book. They're really big and they're just one book. Saga, I almost always think of as multiple. But again, is somebody gonna arrest you? No, because these are all terms out there and things like that. All right. I love this conversation. Again, join me if you want more conversations like that. This is the sort of stuff we get into in Story Sorcery. And I know we had our first live session last night, but we have 3 more. We're going to talk about characters. We're going to talk about how we're going to look at fantasies that are bestsellers right now. What are they doing right? What's their word choice? What's their sentence like? We're going to get into the nitty gritty. We can go into the writer's desk and we can pull all kinds of data and we can look at that. And that's really fun. And then we're going to look at how to make effective scenes within fantasy and particularly laying out some of those major plot beats, again, within fantasy. So I look forward to seeing you there. I look forward to seeing you here. Please like and subscribe. We're going to have more content next week, 1:00 on Tuesday. And yeah, we'll see you around. Thank you so much, everybody. You have a wonderful day. Bye.